So we're going to start the day off with a very important topic for the United States, decarbonizing our transportation sector. And just so everyone knows, our transportation sector is the largest carbon emitter in the world. The U.S. transportation sector is. And so it's really the number one thing we need to be focusing on so we can deal with climate change. So we're excited about our panel here. And I'm going to start with Anthony Pearl, who's a professor of urban studies and political science at Simon Fraser University. And Anthony has done a lot of research on the intersection between transportation, energy, and cities. And so with that, please welcome Anthony Pearl, Dr. Anthony Pearl.
Good morning, and thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to be back in Washington and at another high-speed rail conference. I've really enjoyed the participation, but more importantly, the ideas and insights that get shared at these events. So I'm here to suggest to you, as in the title of this panel, that decarbonizing the transport sector in the United States really requires high-speed rail to get where it needs to go. So I'll answer my first question. The answer is yes. Now I'll explain why that might be the case. About 15 years ago, I wrote a book called Transport Revolutions, Moving People and Freight Without Oil, just about the same time as the association was founded. So I guess it was good timing. Andy picked up on it and asked me to sort of participate ever since. But the idea was that if we really were serious about moving people and freight without oil, it would take some more than incremental changes. And that means in less than 25 years, a 50% increase or decrease in transport activity levels with different modes and different energy sources, reaching out to more than a niche part of the population. There's a saying in politics that there's no greater sin than being 10 years or more ahead of your time. And I guess I'm a sinner because after 15 years, we haven't made much progress on moving people and freight without oil. But now it does seem people are at least more interested in that question. So in 2008, when I wrote the book, 95% of the world's transportation was powered by one form of petroleum-based energy or another, and 5% was powered by everything else, most of which was actually still problematic, things like coal-powered electricity, but still, it was 95% petroleum. 15 years later, well, 14, I couldn't get the latest statistics from the Energy Information Agency in the U.S. This is, we're down to 90% of the U.S. transportation system. So we've made some progress, biofuels, natural gas, and a bit more electricity. But if we're going to have a transport revolution and keep up with the challenges of the climate change that we're living in on a daily basis, we're going to have to really pick up the pace of our change. And right now, the most popular solution seems to be the battery electric vehicle. Plug it in, charge it, no emissions from the vehicle. Seems like the ideal solution, especially because it allows us to keep using the same infrastructure that was built for the automobile. But I'd like to suggest to you with humility that this is going to leave some people, many people, disappointed if we try to just simply swap out the internal combustion engine automobile for the battery electric powered automobile. Arnold Glasow had a saying in the 20th century. He said that expecting something for nothing is the most popular form of hope. And when people hope for the future of battery electric vehicles, I think they are hoping that it will be cheaper and cleaner, and that you can just, as I said, replace each gas-powered vehicle with an electric one. I think that is unlikely to meet Glasow's definition of what people will be finding popular. And that's because battery electric vehicles require a lot of inputs that are actually problematic in their own right. Minerals in particular are much more needed to make those battery electric vehicles: lithium, cobalt, nickel. You can see all the different ones here in this illustration. And in just a couple of cases, they're also needed for the current types of internal combustion vehicles. But in all cases, you need a lot more of these minerals to make battery electric vehicles. And that's going to be a problem to replace each vehicle out there with one of these mineral hogging battery electric vehicles. Some of those minerals are already scarce. Lithium is not plentiful, and forecasts that I've found suggest that we're looking at having scarcity and shortages by the end of this decade, by 2030. So that's going to be a problem. And the access to those minerals, just yesterday's New York Times had a front page article saying, basically, you can't get batteries in scale and large amounts without having China make them. They have pretty much locked up some of the key input sources, cobalt, lithium, those sorts of things, as well as the production facilities to turn those into batteries. So it's not an easy path necessarily. And then there's the environmental impacts and the cost of mitigating them. There's a lithium mine and some unfortunate people who have to live near it. You can see off on the side, mitigating the damage, pollution, and risks from those mines, and the social impacts of having children and others doing that labor currently in various developing countries. That's going to add costs as well. So battery electric vehicles are going to not be a cheap replacement for the internal combustion engine. But fortunately, we don't need as many cars, and we won't need as many cars as that one-to-one replacement suggests. And the good news is that people younger than me understand the difference between mobility and automobility. There's a lot of people out there who understand that transportation doesn't mean owning a vehicle. So going forward, at least in local trips and community-based mobility, there's people who are quite willing to share and use more efficient options, from the scooters I see whizzing by on the sidewalks here in Washington, to biking and walking, and sharing of vehicles. And it's my generation that will slowly fade out with our one car per person expectations. So that could actually work on the local scale. And the formula that I would leave for you, that people of the younger generations have already figured out: having the convenience of an automobile at the price of a bus ride, that meets Glasow's definition of getting something for nothing and will satisfy people and inspire hope. And we already see it today in people's embrace of mobility as a service, using your apps to get where you want to go at a very reasonable price and on-demand service. There's no reason that only needs to be happening in the local communities. There's no reason why you can't have high-speed rail in that same ecosystem, and getting between cities would just be another click that you choose on your apps. But the technology that we have in place for intercity travel can't really work without that high-speed rail component. This is an interesting photo. It's not staged. This is a camera that was set up at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam for the morning, just taking a picture every 2 or 3 minutes. And that's what, when you see an airport, you don't really realize just how busy and how many flights there are, but that's a morning's worth of takeoffs from the airport. And I'm not sure that short to medium haul distance flying has a future as a mode of mass transportation. Airlines certainly are treating their passengers like mass transit, cramming them in and running their operations like buses with wings. But the frequency and volume of that type of air travel is going to be problematic if we're concerned about carbon. Here is the world's most successful solar-powered aircraft. The good news is zero emissions, zero oil, but the bad news is it can only carry 2 people. And it made one trip around the world, which got a lot of attention just before the pandemic, on June 26th. It's not coincidental, the longest day of the year, or maybe it's the 22nd. And the temperature got down to about 35 degrees at night, because they couldn't afford to, when the sun was down and they were flying, keep the engines going and the heat. They didn't have enough energy collected. So it's going to be a while for the solar-powered aircraft or other forms of renewable energy aviation to really kick in. And what about the automated electric aircraft, the flying cars of the future, which are technically out there? Well, I'm old enough to remember at least the second one of these Popular Mechanics covers, but every 30 years, they're just around the corner. So in 1961, flying cars were in. And in 1991, the Sky Car was it and about to take over the skies. I think we're going to be waiting a while for those flying electric cars. Gartner, which is a technology forecasting consultancy, among other things, has a model called the hype cycle that looks at technology and whether it's ready for prime time. And this is from 2022, their hype cycle forecast. You notice that most of the technology for decarbonizing transportation is early in that hype cycle phase. It's in the innovation stage where it's being talked up, and some of it's just coming up to the peak of inflated expectations where people think this is going to be a game changer. And then we have the trough of disillusionment coming up, and a lot of some things are already there. Eventually you get through that, but the result is that you have to pick technologies, if we are really serious now about moving people and freight without oil, that are going to be further out and not stuck in that early stage of the hype cycle, which leads to disappointment and frustration. Yesterday, Congressman Larson actually mentioned Salvador Dali when he was talking about Congress. He said that that's their way that time appears in the U.S. Government. And the question to him or to anyone else who's familiar with that kind of melted down time zones or time space continuum is to ask whether we really do have a decade or more to wait for making those big moves to decarbonize transportation, to wait for the batteries and the breakthroughs that will be needed to get through that hype cycle. If we don't, we're going to be facing more storms of the century. They don't even use that term anymore. A few years ago, there'd be these super storms, and they say it's the storm of the century. Now they're happening every season. Soon they'll be happening every month. It's just an empirical curiosity of mine. How long or how short will the duration between these super weather events have to be before people realize we have a problem? Is it going to be monthly, weekly? If there's 2 a week, will people start to realize that, boy, we got to do something? Well, sooner or later, we will hit that point. California in 2021, and there'll be different consequences. The state was on fire. Right now, my part of Canada, Western Canada, is on fire, and I smelled cinders and smoke when I left Vancouver Sunday afternoon to get here. But there's a real cost to these extreme events and extreme climate impacts that just keeps growing. My homeowners insurance went up by 30% last year, not because of anything we did, but just because more places in the western part of the continent are looking like this, and the insurance companies have to raise the money to pay the claims on those sorts of damages. So we're all going to be paying if we can't manage this better. Well, I don't need to tell people here about high-speed rail, but it's worth just reminding that this is proven technology and decarbonization ready for prime time today. Over half a century, starting with the Shinkansen and the Tokaido line in 1964. So it's got a track record, if you'll pardon the pun, that takes it way beyond the hype cycle of some of these other options. So we're approaching this critical point, I think, in the journey to sustainability. We will either be heading toward a breakdown where our transportation and other systems are just not going to be able to handle the signals that Mother Nature keeps sending us saying this isn't going to be sustainable, or we're going to have a breakthrough. And I think that the breakthrough we're going to have that transport revolution isn't technological. We've got the technology that works. It's a policy breakthrough, which is kind of a good reason for us to be meeting here in Washington. Decarbonizing the U.S. transportation system requires the policy breakthrough to avoid the societal breakdown that's coming forward. And my next colleague on the panel will be talking about a place that has already shown how to do that in one way. China offers a lot of possibilities. And I think that while Europe and Japan offer lessons about mobility, China will be able to teach us about how to make high-speed rail change the society quickly. So thank you very much.
So we don't want to start the day off negative, but that's definitely a sobering presentation, and it really should give us motivation to start speeding up our efforts. Our next speaker is Dr. Zhenhua Chen. He's Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning at Ohio State University. And he's also done a lot of research on China, transportation and city planning and the intersection of those as well. In fact, I think he's written several books on the Chinese high-speed rail system. So please welcome Zhenhua.
Okay, as we're loading the slides, so good morning, everybody. I'd be very glad to be here to share with you some of the empirical evidences from the case of China. One of the nice things of being in academia, as I find out, is you are able to do research without influence from the cultures, ideological, any kind of influence. So that makes your results be more objective. Now, given the limited time, again, I'm going to just show you some of the major kind of works that we have done and have been identified in this field. So we're talking about decarbonizing the transportation system using perhaps high-speed rail as an option. Now, things have already happened in the case of China, as you have already seen. So in this short presentation, I will first give you some ideas about the high-speed rail system in China, particularly talking in terms of how high-speed rail being developed in China in such a rapid pace. Also, I will talk briefly about environment impacts. I know we have talked about environment impacts in different contexts, and that may vary. In this particular context, we are focused now on the impacts on the CO2 emission, air quality. And in addition, we also focus on resilience and land use. So we'll conclude with brief implications for the US. Now, for the case of China, obviously, we have seen this miracles of developing high-speed system in such a rapid pace This just to quickly show you a reflection about what the infrastructure has already been done. What you have seen is one of the key drivers for this development of high-speed rail is because there is a consistent government support from the central government with an average about the 10% annual capital expenditures in rail sectors for over 2 decades. Also, as you can see, the system right now has actually covers almost 30 provinces, all the cities with 500,000 people. Now, people may want to know how China developed such a system. Well, there is a central government planning process. But essentially, if you look into this busy table, it lays out to the 4 different phases, how the government provide a very central plans to guide this process. Now, clearly, these including specific plans in terms of the mileages, the real technologies, but also it includes some of the environment plans as well. Although at the beginning, there is no such a specific consideration, but the system started to add more and more consideration on the environment, on design and the technology application as well. Now, I had a privilege of working with my colleague Anthony and our colleagues in China 2 years ago, and we've been trying to really evaluating this high-speed system in China. So we actually developed this special issues on one of the leading journals in the field, which is really trying to look into, well, given the system has been developed, what is the impacts has already been generated, particularly from the environment perspective. So here I wanted to briefly tell you about some of the results obtained from that kind of special issues. First, in terms of emission impacts, we have already seen that there has been a huge travel behavior changes. After the development of high-speed rails, a lot of the passengers has now started to really using high-speed rail. They used to travel by automobile or conventional rail, and that actually has a huge impact on the environment. Another important impacts we have observed is because after release of the conventional rails capacity, it allows the freight trains to move more efficiently, and that would also contribute to the environment as well. Now, the other aspects of the environment impacts is from the air qualities, air pollutions. Study has already identified, for example, in the corridors where there is along the a high-speed rail along with the highway, there is about a 4.3% reductions of the carbon monoxide, and also there has been a huge improvement of air qualities because of the high-speed rail system. Also, we have seen that high-speed rail has a huge impact on the modal substitutability. Now, this chart basically summarized, as you can see, not only in case of the China, you see after the introduction of high-speed rail, there's a huge reductions of the, employment. But also we have seen that in other countries such as France and also in Tokyo and so on. So this is a very phenomenal kind of impacts, and that you can see that on the environment. Now, some of the other aspects that people tend to ignore, but still play a critical role is the resilience impacts of high-speed rail. Now, the resilience here really talks about how are we able to provide alternative modes for people to travel even under the disruptive events. We actually did extensive research in the case of China. We find out actually under extreme weather conditions, such as the thunderstorms, windy days, foggy days, and so on. Using high-speed rail actually provides with a more reliable ways of intercity mobility than aviation system. And cities with high-speed stations are typically experiencing a much more resiliencies on the other modes as well. So this is certainly an important aspect if we really wanted to make our transportation system be resilient, particularly given the climate change context. Just to quickly summarize, so as you can see, certainly the high-speed system in China has made a phenomenal impacts on the environment. But the key here is really depends on 2 things. One is riderships. Another one is the source of electricity. One caveat to that I haven't mentioned here is in the case of China, again, a lot of the energy sources is still coming from the coal. So in order to further reduce the environment, negative effects, then there's also need consistent efforts to change into renewable energy sources as well. Also, some of the major takeaway, I think, for the U.S. context includes, for example, I think we need more educations. Be thinking about how are we able to educate people, not only about the decision maker, but also general public. When we look into the impacts of high-speed rail, we should not only look into the return to investment, because there's a more wider social economic benefit that has to be captured in these kind of frameworks. Last but not the least is really we have to think about how to improve our efforts to public outreaches and to raise awarenesses, let more people understand about having alternative mode is not just simply make a job easier, but also it makes the whole transportation system be more resilient. With that, I will conclude here, and thank you very much for your attention.
All right, so there we have some good models of what we need to be doing and the kind of pace that we were doing them. China built, I think it's about 25,000 miles of high-speed rail in about 15 years. So that's the kind of big thinking and big moves we need to really be moving this country into. So our next speaker is Tokes Omashakin. He's the Secretary of Transportation for the state of California. He was appointed in February 2022, and he oversees 8 state departments, boards, and commissions with more than 42,000 people and budgets exceeding $25 billion annually. And he's now going to be overseeing the expansion of the California high-speed rail project. So please welcome Secretary Tokes.
Very good morning. Oh boy, that was pretty weak. Goodness gracious. Everybody doing well? Good. Good morning. Excellent morning. I'm thrilled to be at the conference this morning. This is my first time being at the High Speed Rail Conference, and heard a little bit about some of the things that happened yesterday already. I know it was a great conference, and I'm thrilled to get a chance to be a part of it this morning. I want to start off real quickly by thanking Andy and Ezra, the entire team here at High Speed Rail, the advisory board, for all the work that they're doing to continue to uplift this issue. I'm obviously biased, but I think this is probably one of the most important efforts as it relates to transportation in the history of this country. You can go back and talk about what happened in the 50s and 60s as we went down the path of building this immense highway system that is the envy of the world. But now I think we have a unique opportunity, a really good opportunity to create some true balance in the transportation system. If we can build out, not only in California, this high-speed rail that we're working on, that we are going to get open in 7 years. I know you heard from Brian Kelly yesterday, but the rest of the states across the country as well. So I'm excited to get a chance to share a little bit of the broader perspective from California this morning. I don't know if the slides are already loaded in, and so let me just start as the slides come up. The perspective we have from California is that we are seeing, or we're leaning into more strongly an evolution in transportation. That transportation for many years used to be about, in California and many places across the world, was heavily focused on time, on budget. That was the main measure. And in California, we're going through a little bit of again, an evolution, a transition into saying transportation really should be more about the bottom line. It shouldn't just be on time and on budget, but it should be what kind of impact is it having on people. And I got a chance just this year already, in the first 4 months of this year, to go see how this is high-speed rail is working in other places. You heard from both presentations early on this morning. So I got a chance to go to Japan and ride the Shinkansen and also the Eurostar in Europe. And I can tell you, the efforts that all of you in this room are leading and that we're leading from California, again, one of the most important efforts that we're taking on in transportation. I wholeheartedly believe it. Because I got a chance to experience with some of our team firsthand how this is making a difference in these places. Again, Japan will be celebrating 60 years of high-speed rail next year. They've been at it for a long time, but unbelievable experience. My first time getting a chance to experience both of those. So I mentioned the evolution that's happening and a different perspective that we have in California today. If we're going to achieve better outcomes for people in transportation, what I firmly believe is these 4 things. If we can focus on these 4 things, we will have better outcomes for people through transportation. Number 1, it has to be safe. Number 2, we can't just give a lot of lip service to equity, which has been what's happened for so many years in transportation. And again, the very topic that we're focused on in this session, decarbonization, climate action, what impact it has on sustainability and the environment is key. And we leave out often the economic impact of transportation, the economic impact. And so if we get these 4 right, I think continued transformation and creating better lives for people in transportation. The professor, Anthony, I think you mentioned some of the impacts that climate change has had, particularly in California, like the slide, unfortunately, of the $70 to $90 billion in impact in fires in just 1 year in 2021. A little bit more perspective just to keep in mind, in 2020, we had a little over 4 million acres burned in fires in California, over 4 million acres. That's larger than the size of Rhode Island and Delaware combined. In just 1 year, we burned. This year, 27 million gallons, 27 trillion gallons through 9 atmospheric rivers. You saw all the flooding that happened. So immense amount of environmental impact. If we, not if, I keep saying if, don't quote me on saying if, when we build out the California high-speed rail project, we're looking at 2 million metric tons being taken off as far as GHG in the state. That's the equivalent of roughly 400,000 vehicles coming off the road, the equivalent of the total number of vehicles in San Francisco. coming off the highway system when this project opens. And we're not just looking at what will happen when the project is complete. We're also keeping in mind as we build this first leg, this first 171 miles, as we build it, what are some of the construction practices? What are we doing in the meantime as a part of construction? And I can tell you, you heard from Brian Kelly and his team already. They're very keen. They're very locked into some of the environmental impacts. For example, as you see on the second bullet, environmental product declarations from the construction team as they're building the project to make sure that this is one of the most clean construction projects in the entire country. They're also even looking at the possibility of increasing the number of ZEVs that are used as a part of construction as well. All the construction vehicles on site to move back and forth the material on site as well. So again, not just thinking about what's going to happen in 7 years when this project opens, but construction practices today as well. So I like to call this core four, what we call these core four areas, I like to call them and issues, not or issues. And when I say that, what I mean is in the past, very often issues around economic investment or economic, increase in economic activity has sort of been seen as something that is very separate and different from being focused on the environment. And I think you can do both. You can do and. You can invest in climate. You can invest in the environment at the same time. So they're and, not or issues. And if you can see some of the impact that's happened in California, I know Brian probably shared this yesterday, but in February, we celebrated 10,000 jobs being created, and most of those jobs to people in the Central Valley. If you're not familiar with that part of California, some of the most economically depressed parts of the state are right there, probably even in the United States. Are right in the Central Valley region. Again, a majority of these 10,000 jobs since the projects started are from directly in this area. And we're looking ahead again of what the labor impact will be when the project is completed, when the project is open. $23.5 billion in potential labor income and $65 billion in economic output just from the first segment, of the 171 miles on the project. And when it comes to equity, again, I believe we have in the past, as it relates to transportation, we haven't done our very best in this area. I think we've given a lot of lip service to the impact and outcomes as it relates to equity and transportation. But I think this project is going to be a game changer as it relates to equity. I mentioned already the 10,000 plus now jobs that have been created, and the fact that it's been targeted specifically at one of the most underserved parts of the state, but also business opportunity that this project is given. $1.3 billion to small businesses and DBEs since the inception of the project. But beyond that, if you know a little bit about California as well, the housing crisis that we're facing. Right now, it's estimated that we're more than 2 million units short of where we need to be from a housing standpoint. When this project is completed, you're going to connect the agricultural hub, if you will, of the entire United States and the Central Valley with from a technology standpoint, one of the most advanced technology hubs in the entire world. Again, connect both of those. The Bay Area, easily one of the most expensive places to live in the entire country. Being able to connect that to, again, a major agricultural hub and back and forth, what that's going to mean for low-income families from education, providing education for people who actually work on the job, healthcare, et cetera. So we're thinking about how this project is going to connect beyond just from the Bay Area to the Central Valley or from the Bay Area to LA. I'll cover this in a little bit more detail in a presentation I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But just this year alone, the green and the blue dots show you just this year alone where I've had the opportunity on behalf of Governor Gavin Newsom, been able to roll out TRCP projects, Transit Intercity Rail Capital Program projects, to the tune of roughly $3.2 billion just in this calendar year alone. And since the inception of this program in 2015, more than $1.2 billion in investments, transit investments in the Central Valley, which is where we're building this first leg of the high-speed rail. So again, thinking about the project just beyond the linear path of the project itself, but the connections into into cities and communities across the state along the high-speed rail line project. And I'll try to get through the rest of this real quickly because I know we've got a panel session coming up. But safety being the last part of the core four I wanted to cover real quickly. Everybody in the room, most of you are in transportation, you know we're at a 16-year high in many cases as it relates to traffic fatalities in this country. In California, we represent a little over 10% of traffic fatalities in the entire United States. I think Texas may be the other one that's roughly 10% as well. In California, the number last year estimates 4,400 people. 4,400 people died using transportation in California. If you can imagine that, that's roughly 12 people every day. 12 people. So we've got the same vision zero that a lot of your communities and states have, that by the year 2050, we're going to get to zero. We're using the safe system approach. We're locked into that approach. We can talk about that more later. But I believe high-speed rail and investing in transit more and more is going to be a key part of having better safety outcomes for the country. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but in comparison to other countries around the world, the United States has sort of plateaued in this area where and seen a recent increase, whereas other countries like Spain and Japan and countries in Europe have seen significant decline and are meeting their goals, and we're falling significantly short on the other hand. Just real quick on this, and I'll go to actually, I think there's a DC graphic here. This map shows what those red lines represent high injury networks as it relates to traffic fatalities in Washington, D.C., where we are. The green areas are where there are high densities of low income and minority or Hispanic populations in the district. And as you can see, a lot of the red lines or those orange lines are in those high injury. Those orange lines are where those colors, those green colors are, which is where, again, the underserved populations are. And it looks the same way in Los Angeles. You see the green lines, they're in where the orange lines, they're where those green polygons are. So to close here, I think this project is going to be revolutionary for not only California in making this connection, ultimately this 500-mile connection from the Bay Area to LA, but potentially for the country as well. Japan, 60 years, Europe, they've been doing this, China, 15, 20 years, they've been able to get a 20,000 plus mile system built. If and when we are done in California, it's going to help make this even more realistic and a reality for states across states like Texas and Florida and Georgia who are thinking about who've got projects on the way. We're the farthest in California, but when we're done, it's going to transform the landscape, not only in California, but the rest of the country as well. So excited to engage in the panel right afterward. Again, thank you. Sorry I rushed through that.
Thank you, Secretary Winshaken. It's really what has been said is it's really important we get moving on this and scale this up pretty quickly. So we're going to call up the panel now. We're going to have Janice Petit from CNBC is going to be the moderator. She's a producer doing a great stories and shows on high-speed rail, really investigating transportation and as well. We want to thank Janice for all the great reporting you're doing. And then also we have Shelley Patisha, who's the Chief Climate Strategist for the National Resource Defense Council. And I've known Shelley for probably 20 years. She has a long history in urban planning with Congress for New Urbanism and as a way to be able to have cities and places where you can live without cars. And that's a really important part of decarbonizing. So please come on up the panel and we'll discuss this all further.
Shelley, you mentioned this morning. I thought it was a good place for us to start. Why do you think the environmental community is not more supportive of high-speed rail in this country?
Well, that's a great question. It's really nice to be here too. Great room, people. The environmental community is supportive of changing transportation modes, changing toward high-speed rail. They have really gotten stuck on, and we have really gotten stuck on electrifying cars and trucks. And as you were saying earlier, both of you were saying it's kind of an interim strategy. I think the environmental community is frustrated that it has taken so long in the United States to see high-speed rail come to be. And we're on a time frame. We're likely to overshoot our goals in 2030. We're going to have to really lean in order to make our 2050 goals. And so that's why if we can unlock this, unstick it in a way that we can really see more high-speed rail systems get in place, the environmental community is going to be there.
It does seem infrastructure projects take especially long in this country. What lessons can we learn, maybe say from China, and how to build things faster and better? Yeah, and is the US just really bad at infrastructure projects?
Well, first of all, different country is different and they have a different political context and the culture context. And so it's kind of harder to just to simply apply China's example, for example, to the US. However, I personally do think that there are certain things that the US may be able to learn. For example, one thing is China has a long-term consistent plan all over the time, as you can see, starting from 2004 and then 2018, and then they started to, move over. So they try to build up the system step by step. So I think we also needed to, again, if we're thinking about building high speed here in this country, we have to set up the kind of consistent plan. That's number one. Number two is that we also need to have a consistent support. The support will be coming from all the different stakeholders, not just simply about the federal government, but also we need to get the community support, get the state government support, and the private sector support. So we have to create that kind of consensus so that to make that the system happens. Number three is certainly we needed to have a more kind of resources that to be spent to this field. One thing I think was really lacking behind in the US is really research, R&D. If you're thinking about in China's case, so they actually spend a lot of monies on our research and development. So there's actually a lot of need here in this country. How can we really make the system feed to the needs of the people here? So those are the things I certainly think that was really important. Anthony, maybe you have something. Yeah.
Sorry, turn his mic on.
Yes, China made a conscious decision and they stuck with it. Democracy has more challenges with consistent support and policy engagement. I always use Churchill's phrase about the United States. It applies to high-speed rail too. Most people don't know his mother was American, so Churchill was actually binational. He said that the American can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. So we still haven't realized that these alternatives are not going to get us where we need to go. I think when we finally realize that batteries in every car are not enough to solve our problems, then we will get committed to this option more significantly.
You mentioned support. Why is Washington not even looking at high-speed rail as part of its decarbonization efforts? I see so much emphasis on electric vehicles. I've done a lot of reporting on electric vehicles. But what's going on there, and how can we change that? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's another very important question. Look, I think the support has probably been the best that it's ever been.
I agree.
You have, I think, from what I understand, Speaker Pelosi was here. Speaker Emeritus Pelosi was here yesterday. You've got a president of the United States whose nickname is Amtrak Joe, who's a firm believer in rail. You've got a period where FRA has got the highest, I think, Amit, the administrator of FRA, is probably going to be here at this conference. You got, more than $34 billion that's been set aside in IIJA for rail investments, which are going to be impactful for this. You've got, again, record high investments in FTA on the transit side that are similar to those TRCP projects that I mentioned. Transit is going to be a key connector to what's we're trying to do with high-speed rail in California and the rest of the country as well. So I think this has been the best period. Could it have been better? Oh, absolutely. We've seen some really dark years, if you will, from this space, but we have to keep looking forward from this point, from where we are right now, to see how we can continue to heighten the understanding and interest of why of high-speed rail and why this is so important for the country. But the best period by far that we've had, I think Secretary LaHood, who's in the room, I think he helped get us really going on a platform for this nationally, because again, then Vice President Biden was very interested in this. So I think, again, the best period we've had so far, especially when it comes to dollars.
American cities are built for cars. How can we convince Americans to get out of their cars? And what sort of changes do we need to make to cities as we build the high-speed rail in California? What changes do cities need to make right away to ensure ridership? Any thoughts on?
Well, this is actually happening, and the market for walkable cities, walkable neighborhoods is on fire. Living here, I lived in the Bay Area for almost 30 years and saw the kind of evolution of development around the transit systems. It's now starting to really take off. The DC area, you just like blink your eyes and a new transit-oriented neighborhood is up, rented, sold. It is happening. And we need in this country to really be working with local leaders to see the win-win-win, as you were talking about in your presentation, health, equity, economics, jobs, of connecting the way we build our cities around our transit systems. And we're only going to get the big numbers, the big shifts in mode and the big reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if we create these seamless systems. The idea that people are going to drive to these stations and, you know, get on the train, come back, drive home, that is so old school. And the demand is really here for a different way of building in our country.
Any lessons there from China or Europe, and how we can?
Look, I'll just say real quick, I'll echo those comments completely. On this visit to Europe and Japan earlier this year, we got one of the most intriguing parts of the visit was getting to spend some time at the stations, not necessarily the ride back and forth between major cities, Osaka and Tokyo, but just what's happening at the stations, because they were true TODs, like you were mentioning what's happening here. But I mean, when you think of a TOD, in some cases in the American context, you think of a small shop in residential. I'm talking entertainment, offices, residential, everything being built around stations, and the stations are essentially community centers. These are community hubs. So people are not driving to the station to use the train. The train station is where people live, work, play, everything. And that's the place where we have to get to, where transit centers become places of living in this country. Is that going to work in every context? Probably not. I mean, we've got still significant populations in this country that live in rural areas. Being able to have those transit legs that connect to those are going to be important. But these stations have to become community centers. They have to be places in themselves. And I think we're doing that, trying to do that in many cases across the country, but particularly with the high-speed rail project in California. That's the outlook we have.
It's going to take a while to retrofit suburbia. But in the meantime, I do think mobility as a service apps will help bridge that transition. Remember this formula: the convenience of a car at the price of a bus ride. Whoever's able to deliver that will get people to switch from owning their own car and cooking the planet to these sustainable options. And it is possible to see that happen.
One thing to add is also, as we have also hear a lot, I mean, to make the system successful, we really have to think about how to integrate the high-speed rail with other modes of transportation, like aviation. If you look into examples both in Europe and also in some Chinese cities, high-speed station has been built in the airports, facilitating long haul, short haul sort of transfer. And you also have seamless connections with the public transit system that actually promoted this kind of TOD sort of development as well, and metro as well being connected. So really, we have to think about, in the end of the day, the goal of the high speed is really to facilitate intercity mobility. So how could we really, reduce these barriers, transfer from different modes, allow people to, choose, seamlessly if they would like. That's really the goal. So I think that really needs planners and policy decision maker engineers, all the different, stakeholders work together to develop that kind of holistic plan instead of just working on their own silo. So I think that's the kind of atmosphere we needed to create it in this country, and then more people get involved. And so that's really the key.
America's grid is aging. We still rely on fossil fuels for much of our grid. How are we changing our grid to be able to handle electric high-speed rail as well as all the other electrification? And any good examples from abroad where there's been some success here?
Yeah, again, another important question. The governor Newsom in California recently announced, like 2 weeks ago, the fact that we're 2 years ahead of schedule. My mic is going out. Everybody still hear me? I'll try to talk a little bit louder. You can't hear me. Okay, now I'm back on. So in ZEV deployment, we're 2 years ahead of schedule. We sold 1.5 million ZEVs in California already. We're 40% of the entire market for the United States. Same thing with charging infrastructure. We're roughly 40% of the entire ZEV charging infrastructure for America. But what is that doing to our grid? It's increasing, no doubt. It's increasing that demand. Two things. One, we're heavily focused in California on diversifying how we're going to use energy, where the energy source is going to be coming from. Thinking about battery storage, using solar, exploring even wind as a part of how transportation is charged. By the way, in California, 50% of the GHG comes from transportation, 50%. For the country, it's 29%, according to EPA, and for the globe, it's 15% for the entire globe, roughly. So we have to decarbonize, but we have to, as we decarbonize, it can't just be the grid only. So what we're doing is trying to figure out, again, how do you diversify how energy is deployed, not only into transportation, but across the entire state for energy demand, energy usage. And number two, we've got clear examples in Europe of how they're doing exactly that. In the EU, wind is a big part of how they're getting energy sources to power transportation.
You know, I think this sort of gets to another theme that's rippling through this conversation, which is we can't really meet these goals if we're all working in our own silos. Because if the high-speed rail community, the transportation community is out there advocating for switch to renewables and greater investment in transmission, that's going to create another constituency that's out there trying to really move us forward. I cannot tell you how many folks call me all the time saying, there's a bill in my state that is trying to preclude our community from switching over to renewables. It is a massive problem across the United States, particularly in those states that have the highest transportation emissions. So we have a mutual benefit to work together. And maybe that's the sea change we also need to see.
Do we have a few minutes for questions? Does anyone have a question from the audience? Yes, right here in the middle.
Well, thank you. First, this is a great question. So as you probably can remember recall about the slides I mentioned there. So there are 4 different phases of the rail development plan. At the very initial stage, at the 2004 and 2008, at that time, carbon emission was really not on the agenda. However, if we look into the more recent plan, which was released in 2020, carbon emission was really explicitly mentioned there. So that basically means, by the year of 2035, they have to reach this, carbon emission goal. And one of the key things is that the green transportation infrastructure is the key. So that is to say, they're trying to actually encouraging, high-speed rail development and trying to shift more of the, cargoes and passengers to the rail system. So there is certainly kind of directions going there and trying to toward that kind of target. And also in addition to that, there's also kind of technologies associated with that in terms of how to use in the green kind of technologies to facilitate that kind of energy use efficiency. So certainly I'd be happy to share with you more about that, but there's certainly a strong efforts now moving in that direction now.
For one more question, right there.
Line of the siloing. I'm from Ohio, but I just read an article from back in October of one of the mega sites in Ohio that I thought maybe could make a nice, TOD or whatever. But it's titled, "This Will Change Our World." Honda is building a new battery plant in Ohio. Great, but they're probably closing down 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of the other ones. They're reaching. So I agree. Electric cars will just, or these autonomous cars, will just have more cars driving around without anybody in it. Then maybe Ohio, maybe we could follow your lead there, California. Okay. All right.
We are out of time. I do have one other question from my 3-year-old son. He is certain he wants to be a train conductor. Do you think by the time he's in his 20s, he can get a job on California high-speed rail?
You said 20?
He's 3 now, so or mid-20s.
Can he start sooner? Yeah. If he can start at like 14 or 10, by the time he's 10, if he's ready to come on down, we'll be glad to have him on the team.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll let him know.
Yeah. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you.